Have you ever had an experience so traumatizing that it changed the very core of who you are? I bet you remember who you used to be before that pivotal moment when everything changed. Maybe you even miss who you once were. Trauma can go years without being addressed. People either don't realize they still carry it with them every day, or they don't want to face the depth of the emotional wound it's caused. I can understand why. It takes courage and deep vulnerability to relive the hardest parts of your life so you can move past them. But what's interesting is the ways in which some individuals process their trauma through their creative practice, finding ways to give their trauma a different meaning and reclaim control. What is most important to me is not that the trauma happened in the first place, but whether we let it define us. What we do with that trauma after the fact. So, how do you reclaim control? In a quantitative trial of mindfulness art therapy targeted towards women with cancer, Monti et al. Found that those who engaged in art making demonstrated statistically significant decreases in symptoms of physical and emotional distress during treatment. The relaxation and symptom reduction produced by creative expression opened pathways to emotional healing. Stuckey and Noble 2010. There is such a thing as art therapy, but this also leads me to question whether art born from trauma could also be classed as an entirely new genre of art that is based around psychology, but that's a topic for another time. I want to talk about Kim Nobles first. Her paintings have an urgency that makes me want to prioritise her work. Kim is just an overarching name given to her physical body, as she holds 13 personalities within her, each who process their trauma through different art styles. Her dissociative identity disorder is a way that she copes with her childhood trauma.
I mean, it's still me, but I just accept being called Kim.
Armour 2018. I'm focusing on works that were painted by one of her 13 personalities, a 12-year-old girl called Rhea Pratt who experienced dehumanizing rituals and child abuse. In Ted Saw It All, Nobles and Pratt, No Date, I see a lack of detail in the face of the abuser, all but for a sickening evil smile. The crescent is such an unassuming shape in its own right, but in this context tells me all I need to know about the emotion and quality of mind that the offender possesses. The use of contrasting bright, cheerful colours with a dark subject matter brings about the feeling of unease as we look at something that is usually a friendly and happy expression on another person's face. Children especially are susceptible to facial expressions as we learn very young how to interpret a person's mood based on the expression shown on their face. Maltreated children may associate certain expressions of emotion with traumatic experiences, which can, in turn, influence the meaning these youth ascribe to these expressions. Pollack, Cicchetti and Clawman 1998, Maston et al. 2007. Even something as small as the interpretation of a smile is being reclaimed through Rhea's art. In Daisy Chain, Nobles and Pratt, No Date, the contrasting visuals continue. They appear to be a recurring theme within her paintings, whether it is the sizing of these figures or the bright colours used to tell her story. They are all at odds with the dark scenes unfolding within every painting. Knowing that a child sees these acts through the lens of innocence, by depicting the visuals bursting forth in a kaleidoscope of bright colours, akin to a cartoon or children's book, is heartbreaking.
I had to explain my mental health issues to explain the art because they came actually hand in hand. For me, it helps me learn about the other personalities and get a feel and understanding of them.
Armour 2018. Some might see this as a way to live around a mental health condition, but I see it as a way of reclaiming the control that was taken from her as a child when she was abused. The personalities themselves are a way to protect her brain from the abuse, but the use of different styles in her personality's art and the different topics they tackle help her to process the emotions brought about by them. For some people, reclaiming control might not mean that they have used their art to process their trauma fully. It might just mean that through their art they are able to address it and make the necessary steps forward on their journeys. This leads me on to the next artist, who didn't use her art as a means to process her trauma, but rather portrayed her trauma after the fact and owned her mess. Tracey Emin. I know, you either love her or you hate her, but I want to separate the art from the artist for a second. After coming out of a 4-day bender due to a bad breakup where she didn't leave her bed at all during this time, we've all been there before, She looked at her bed and realised that all the disgustingness and anguish present within the folds of the sheets and the piles of clutter on the floor was a piece of art, a snapshot in time of what she had endured. Of my bed, Emin, Tracey said,
"Now the bed has become like a ghost of my past, and all the things on it don't relate to me anymore. They relate to a much, much younger woman. What really stands out is this whole kind of atmosphere of something long gone."
It's interesting that the installation of the piece is different every time it's erected. Castro and Philo, 2017, evoking a different feeling in the artist. Reclaiming control isn't just an instantaneous thing or a linear thing that people gain from using art. I think it can happen over decades, and the installation continues to work with the artist in aiding them on their journey. I suppose you could say that looking at your art during different times of your life makes you realise that reclaiming control looks different depending on your current circumstances in life and the experiences you've had since the trauma was first had. On the flip side, those that might try to tackle their trauma might fail in reclaiming control. But isn't this all just part of the journey? Just because the gratification isn't instantaneous doesn't mean at some point down the line it doesn't result in a breakthrough. When looking at my bed, what greets us is the raw picture of a deteriorating life. The fact that it's composed of everyday objects and intimate belongings makes it feel so much more real than any painting might. Like peeking through a window into someone's life, it almost feels like we shouldn't be viewing the artist during one of the most vulnerable times in her life. The build-up of stains and used objects is almost a direct parallel to Tracey's mental health during the time she spent in her bed. It isn't hard to imagine the artist tossing and turning in the bed as she experiences her mental health spiralling. It's in the folds of her sheets that we see the movement and energy of her without her physically being there. There is chaos and there is life. Sometimes the reclamation of control comes from reclaiming the space inside your head that is inhabited by thoughts of the trauma, or even reclaiming your gender after being belittled by a family member for not having certain genitals. Louise Bourgeois is one such artist that tackled both these things by acting out old fantasies and creating feminist art. The Destruction of Father, Bourgeois, is an old fantasy laid bare. It is thought by some that the death of Louise Bourgeois' husband is what provoked the old feelings to re-emerge. Respect, 2021. The installation addresses the overbearing nature and power that her father held over her and her family. The tableau's inspiration arose from a childhood fantasy in which she imagines a dinner at which her family, tiring of hearing the father's satisfied boasts, dismember and cannibalize him, thus pushing and tipping the power struggle for authority from her father's grasp to Bourgeois and her siblings. Weaver, 2020. My personal interpretation of this piece is more so one of claustrophobia. The heavy, present feeling of the round, sexually charged bumps protruding from the ceiling and jutting up from the ground is what I feel most predominantly. The complete disregard for whoever might be sitting around the table, or in this case, observing the installation. It physically prevents you from freely walking around it, but at the same time, the soft materials used and the red hues present gives me the impression that we're inhabiting the stomach of a person, and we've been swallowed whole by a higher being. Louise held a certain amount of contempt for her father, and it makes sense when discovering what kind of childhood Louise Bourgeois experienced. One of infidelity, lies, and betrayals by not only her father, but by another adult close to her. She recalls her father saying "I love you" repeatedly to her mother, despite infidelity. Weaver, 2020. Although she learned to love her father in adulthood, she obviously still held onto a lot of pain all throughout her adult life. To me, the acting out of a fantasy through an art installation is her version of reclaiming control by separating herself from the fear she felt. Sex seems to be largely what her work focuses on, mostly due to her father's influence. Whether it was about the long-term affair he was having, or the sex of a person, it is no surprise to me that works such as Nature Study, Bourgeois, heavily focus on sex and the blurred line between genders. In a video where Louise shows us a party trick that her father taught her, she draws a female figure onto a tangerine, making sure that the genitals are drawn at the base of the tangerine. She proceeds to peel it.
Now, this whole story was addressed to me at the dinner table in front of everybody, right? And my father, who directed his stupid humor towards me, would say, "Oh, oh, this little figure is so pretty. I think she's my daughter, right? I thought she was my daughter, but obviously she's not my daughter because my daughter has nothing there.
Referring to the phallic shape that is pulled out of the base of a tangerine when peeled.
So I would blush. I would die on the spot in front of everybody. You know, I was not a man. It's a feminist statement. I was only a woman who didn't have anything there.
ZCZ Films 2013. I can imagine just how damaging it would be to hear such a remark from someone who is supposed to love you and accept you for who you are, not care about what you are not. But I love that Louise reclaims what sex means to her and how it affects her compared to her reaction as a child. Not only that, but as a feminist artist, she celebrates her own gender and is unapologetic in her art. Finally, I want to tackle Yayoi Kusama's work. I wasn't very familiar with her art prior to this project, but I discovered a plethora of gems when I visited Tate Modern to see her current exhibition, Infinity Rooms, Kusama 2022. The 7 minutes I spent lining up to get into both Chandelier of Grief, Kusama 2016, and Infinity Mirrored Room, filled with the brilliance of life, Kusama 2018, was well worth the wait. She uses her art in such a way that it harnesses her fear and provides a way to remain sane, Lens 2012. Even looking at her extensive use of polka dots through her work and her tendency to create mirror rooms is a way for her to extract those hallucinations and emotions within herself and present them to the rest of the world to experience. And there is control in that. Trauma is infinite, but just because it can't be undone doesn't mean you can't move past it. When I visited Filled with the Brilliance of Life, her descriptions of the panicked experiences that she has, which provoked this piece, and the actual beauty of the piece itself were very much at odds with one another. Her fearful emotions of the earth and stars not being alone, but rather the entire universe being made of an accumulation of stars, and the volume of not only those, but the flowers she sees, make her panic and feel overwhelmed. Lens 2012. Those fearful emotions are transformed into something beautiful and now mean something different to her. She didn't just change the meaning of those experiences for herself, but she controlled who else experiences them, and to an extent, the viewer's thoughts and feelings about them. She shows us that it doesn't have to be a scary experience, but it can be beautiful and memorable. This is another theme present in her Chandelier of Grief room, Kusama 2016. According to Tate Modern's display caption, it suggests that we can experience beauty and sadness at the same time, Kusama. You can choose to either concentrate on the grief and the feelings that make you uncomfortable, or you can choose to focus on the beauty surrounding you, despite all these things, which is what I interpret as the meaning behind the Baroque chandelier placed in the centre of the room. Even the act of controlling where the viewer looks is interesting, because I feel it's almost encouraging us to look up, to keep our heads held high despite our grief, or trauma, or sadness. Whether this was the message that Kusama wanted to communicate probably isn't likely, but it's what I got out of my visit. There is an empowering air to her work, and even her demeanour. Through reading up on her life, I have come to notice that she doesn't let anything stand between herself or her ability to create art. The act of reclaiming control through her art doesn't just refer to the control of her trauma, but also control of her mental health and her well-being as well. I am led to question my own work through the practice of others reclaiming control. How can I let my art be an outlet to reclaim any control I might have lost? And why might I want to reclaim control? Art is such a useful instrument that has such influence not only on those viewing it, but also the creator as well. I've spent most of my life thinking about what kind of messages I'm getting across with my work, that I never stopped to think about how it affects me and how it might alter the current journey I am on with myself. It makes me realise how much more important the relationship you have with yourself is, and that to make truly authentic art, you must first be true to yourself. The rest will follow.